Hello there, I'm Rafael de Furia, back at it again for another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter. And in this episode, like the title says, I wanted to get into talking about if Braga, Portugal might be the right place for you to live. If you're thinking about moving to Portugal and you want to live in Portugal, live in Braga, Portugal. It's worth considering some of the positive and negative aspects that this city may have to offer. And some of the things that could be a positive for one person might be a negative for another. But just before I get into this episode, I did want to say a huge thank you to those of you who've been supporting this project through Patreon, the one-time donations on rafaeldefuria.com/support, and also Patreon, rafaeldefuria.com/Patreon, as well as the thank you button here on YouTube. And of course, I wanted to say thanks to this week's sponsor, Border.io. They help you to get your Portuguese NIF, your tax code, as well as your bank account here in the country. But I would say that it's probably about time that we get the episode started, so roll that intro. The first thing that I want to get into is to talk about the size of these places and what you will have available to you. In a place like Braga, you're going to find that there is a lot available here, but just shrunken down. But when it comes to entertainment, places to go, things to do, things to experience, you do have quite a bit going on here. However, if you're looking to not just have some good options, but a lot of options to be able to choose from, then you may want to consider a larger city like Porto or Lisbon. And in those places, you'll have a lot of options, but you'll almost have too many options. In Braga itself, you'll have just enough options to keep you entertained, to keep you out, to keep you going. But the good news also about being in Braga is that you do have access to a place like, say, Porto in just under an hour or just over an hour, depending on if you're going there by car or by public transportation. So even if you want to have an evening out on the town, it's not like you can't do that. I mean, even I've been talking recently with friends of mine that, hey, we may go down there for an evening at some point and just to get out of Braga and have a little bit of fun, because you can do that here. But if we're talking about maybe going to restaurants, you're going to have a lot of options in Braga for restaurants. There are a lot of really, really delicious places that you can find here, both in the regular center and outside of the center. Some of the more touristy places, some of the less touristy places. You're going to have a bit of a range in prices. But what I've personally noticed in Braga is that prices do seem to be a little bit higher for eating out here than they do in maybe some other parts of the country. You will in maybe some cities have a wider spectrum of prices, whereas here, I can't say I've seen that same spectrum of prices. You do, of course, still have the lunch deals that you can find, like for, say, €7 or €8 or €5 on occasion, where you can have a couple courses or the main plus a coffee and a dessert and whatever. It depends. Or even some places will do a dinner deal here where you could have a main, a starter in some cases, and then a glass of wine for maybe 12 to 15 euros. It really depends on the place. And there are not a ton of places that do those meal deals at dinner time, but you can still find it. So that's the good news.
And just before we get into the next section of this episode, a quick word from this week's sponsor. A big thanks to Border for sponsoring this week's episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter. Border offers the easiest way to get your NIF and Portuguese bank account, both of which are integral parts of your move to Portugal. Border can help you from any location around the world, wherever you are remotely, so that you don't have to travel to Portugal. Also at Border, you'll be dealing with English speakers who offer excellent customer support. They'll help you accomplish these necessary steps to get your new life started here in Portugal. Visit border.io/NYAG. That's BORDR.io/NYAG. Thank you again to Border for sponsoring this week's episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter, and let's get back into the episode.
And then when it comes to having options for going shopping for food, of course, getting around to those places, let's actually talk about getting around first. In a place like Braga, you're going to have a lot of options that are going to be within walking distance if you're closer to the center. But even if you're, say, a little bit outside of the central area, we're talking about maybe a 20-minute walk instead of a 5-minute walk. It's not that bad at the end of the day. Like I mentioned, even in not the previous episode, but the episode before, talking about kind of the layout of Braga, that even if you're over by Braga Park, you could still theoretically walk all the way from there to the center, 25 minutes maximum if you're walking a little bit on the slow side, but it's still at a decent pace. And you will have some options over there in that part of town for restaurants and even supermarkets. And even if you live in that neighborhood over there, the mall itself does have a Pingo Doce inside. Pingo Doce is one of the supermarket chains here. You have Pingo Doce, Mercadona, Continente. These are some of the main ones that you do find here, as well as Os Três Mosqueteiros, if I'm not mistaken. And for some of those, you will have to maybe go a little bit further out, or maybe at a mall, especially for a hypermarket. Those you'll find more so at a mall. Sometimes you will find some standalone supermarkets, but you do also have access to mini markets and fruit and veg shops that they just only have fruit and vegetables, or that you will find butchers that do just have meat. That's something that I do like, that you still have those options where you can get friendly with the person behind the counter. But even at some of the supermarkets here, I will say I have become somewhat friendly-ish with the people behind the counter. And there's actually someone, funny enough, who is moving to Italy in the next little bit. If you happen to be watching this, just saying a little hello, you know who you are. Then, it's a small town, so it's funny how those things can happen. That already somebody who's moving to Italy saw my videos about moving to Bolzano or life in Milano in this area. And they're like, wait, hold on. Are you Rafael the Furia? Like, well, that depends. Did you like the videos or not? But it really, at the end of the day, that's one nice thing about being in a smaller city like Braga. Am I going to say that's going to be the experience for everybody and that they're just going to have the people that they connect with at every store? Absolutely not, because it is still a city. In a place like maybe Porto or Lisboa, maybe you will have like your cafe or your little place that you go to that you will be able to build up that regular kind of status. It's nice to become a regular at a place and for them to know who you are and to build up your habitual presence at a place. It's just, in my opinion, it's never bad to have that and to have your face be recognized at a certain place, because at a certain point, you may see that you get treated a little bit better than maybe the person who just walks in for the first time. And especially, like, say if something's, and this is not just about Portugal, by the way, but maybe say something is out of stock, or this actually happened to me recently. There's a place here that I like in Braga. I don't go there so often, but they know my face there. And I was interested in a booth seat, but it was a busier time and it was only 2 people that were going to be sitting, and it was for 4 people. But he was like, look, you know what? Because it's you, come on, like, here, I'll just sit you down. It's fine. These things can happen when you become a regular. Those little fringe benefits, maybe they'll take a look in the back for something that they wouldn't have taken a look in the back for if it were just some regular tourist or somebody who they maybe were less familiar with. But because you're regular, sometimes people do go out of their way. But this is kind of really getting to a whole different topic here. But again, getting around the city. In Lisbon, you've got a metro system, a tram system, a bus system. The public transport there overall, I would say, is pretty evolved. And really, you have a lot of places that are very well connected. In Porto, you also have a lot of places that are very well connected. You have the metro system, which is part metro, part tram. It goes above ground and underground. It's kind of a mixed system of sorts. And then also, of course, you have buses, but the system, at least for the metro, isn't as developed as Lisbon. There are not as many stops. Of course, it's a smaller city. So it's, of course, not going to be the same. But in a place like Braga, you're not going to have an option for a metro, but you do have buses here that can get you to most places that you need to go. And then, of course, Bolts, Ubers, pretty much everywhere. But of course, if you're going a little further out of town, your mileage may vary as to whether you're able to get a driver or not. And it actually, what was it, a few months ago, I was outside of the city on a pretty busy night. It was a Saturday night and there was some festivities going on in the center. And I had been waiting, maybe it was like about a 10-minute drive outside of the city. I was probably waiting there about 45 minutes, an hour before I finally gave up on trying to get a ride to the center to get to where I was trying to go. And I had drivers that accepted the ride and then canceled. A number had done that. And so this is something you want to keep into consideration. That's why I, in the previous video, not the last video, but the one before that, talking about the size of Braga, recommended that if you're coming here, being closer to the center doesn't hurt. I mean, if you're going to move to a small city, you may as well have a lot of the benefits that come along with it. Unless you're coming here for the university, then being closer to the university. Because even getting from the university to the center itself is not that big a deal. Even when we're talking about getting an Uber or Bolt, whatever it may be, it's still not horribly expensive, especially if you're sharing the ride. And if you are in a more central area, you will have theoretically access to a few different supermarkets and just getting there by foot. But in a place like Lisbon or Porto, having that by foot access may not necessarily be the same. Things are a lot more spread out because there are, of course, a lot more people. And those places, in some ways, may be a little bit easier to get around by car. But, of course, you'll be dealing with a lot more traffic. And that's a huge deal. Here, when I've seen traffic, things are standing still for maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and then you can kind of pass through it. But of course, I'm not a driver here, and this is my experience having been a passenger in a car. So I don't drive, I'm not in a car every day. And being here in Braga, you don't need to have a car if you don't want one, depending on where you live in the city. And even if you are a little bit out of the center, you can still have a very walkable experience here. But like when I was in Lisbon, for example, recently, to get from one place to the other, instead of it being a maximum of maybe 10 minutes from where I live or the location that I'm starting from to the other area, it was, I needed to get maybe a half an hour away, 45 minutes away, just to get to an appointment or to a store or even to a particular restaurant. Whereas in Braga, again, we're talking about really a maximum of like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes if traffic is really, really heavy. But so far, I haven't seen it like so heavy that you can't move anywhere and you're stuck for hours. So that's a huge benefit, in my opinion. In Porto, depending on where you are, you may find that there actually is some pretty bad traffic. There are not that many huge open streets. There is one long open street-ish that you will see some traffic moving up and down pretty smoothly, but even on some of the like highway roads that get close to Matosinhos, those I have seen get pretty packed. I was there recently, and just within a 1 block area, there happened to be like 3 accidents. And to move what should have been maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes, took about 20 or 30 minutes. So that's a big deal, I would say. Even in Braga, could something like that happen? Theoretically, yeah. But if we're talking about cities that are livable, I personally might say that Lisbon doesn't feel necessarily as livable as Porto. It is smaller. That's why I like it. I have a preference for smaller places, but not too small. So if Braga is too small for you and Lisbon is too big, that Goldilocks zone could be Porto for you. But it also depends. Also, what are you looking for? Do you need an international school for your children? You may have more options in the Lisbon-Cascais area than you would in Braga. There is an international school here for children, but will you have so many options? Not like you would in Lisbon necessarily. But then to go in a completely different direction, to order things and buy things online. In Portugal in general, it's not as convenient as some other countries. So being in Braga versus Lisbon, you're not going to necessarily see a huge difference. If you're ordering from a local source online, you may see potentially next day shipping. But if you're going to order from Amazon here, you have to use Amazon Spain, Amazon Germany, Amazon Italy, Amazon France, Netherlands, although I think they mostly sell books still. And in those cases, you will have to wait at least a few days for your shipment to get here. I have had the experience where it has been a couple weeks to get a shipment from Amazon, even Amazon Spain. So Is it going to be as convenient as, say, living in Italy, living in the UK, or living in Germany? Not quite. I wouldn't say that yet. We still have some time to see what could happen there. But you do have online stores here in Portugal where you can have shipping at a reasonable rate, I would say. So overall, does Braga feel like a city? Yes, definitely. It doesn't feel like a small village. You can move to a small village not far from Braga and have some of the benefits of being close to the city. That's one of the really nice things, is that you do have the possibility to live in the city and have the benefits of living in the city, or you drive a little bit out. But having a car in Braga is not necessarily the most convenient. In European cities in general, it's not the most convenient. I would say if you are living in some parts of Porto or Lisbon, then definitely it would be a necessity. Here, maybe to a lesser extent. Also, something to consider is that in Braga specifically, if you're trying to drive around, it kind of sometimes feels like half of the city is going one direction, half the city is going the other direction. And if you miss the point where you need to turn off, then you have to go and do a loop around where you need to go. And that can actually add maybe a maximum of a few minutes. So maybe in a city like Lisbon or Porto, if you make the wrong turn, you'll be dealing with it and it'll be a little bit harder to deal with. That same wrong turn here in Braga wouldn't be as bad. So even I would say if you're living in Braga, it's not necessary to have one. You could have one, but say you need to fly to get to an airport. Getting to the airport, of course, could be more convenient to have a car, but then you have to drop it off and pay for the parking space. But from Braga to get to the airport, again, we're talking about like half an hour, 45 minutes on the highway. You have a bus that goes there. I believe there's even a train option to get there, or I think it's train and bus, whatever, some type of option like that. This is not the important what exactly it is in this episode. But if you are in Porto, for example, of course, that's where the airport is, just outside of the city. So it's a little bit more convenient from there, but it's still outside of Porto. So not necessarily so different than Braga. Definitely closer, but you still have to get there. In Lisbon, you have a lot more options for that airport. You have the metro system, you have Ubers, you have private rides, you have buses, you have a whole bunch of different ways to get there. And overall, I would say it's probably one of the more convenient places if you do have to fly in and out often. It's an airport that's a little bit more major, and they're working on building another airport, but that's been something that's been talked about for years and years now. So is that actually happening? We'll see. We'll figure that out. And if that is the case, then the airport would be outside of the city. At least the new major airport would be. There's still that great airport that you do have that's somewhat centrally located. That's something definitely to consider. But if you need to get around, even here in Braga, a lot of the expats in this community get the cheap flights to go all around Europe, or even there have been a number of people who've gone to North Africa, to Morocco, for example, and they've had a weekend there or a couple days. So you have these options available to you. It's not like being in small little Braga, you're going to be out in the desert and there's nothing here. No, you have options available to you. I mean, even here you have a bunch of travel offices, travel agents rather, that can help you to find some of the places to go and some deals. And I've seen in some cases that you don't really spend that much more, or really anything more than what you would spend otherwise. And if you're savvy, you can sometimes get a much better price than what you would possibly get otherwise. Also, dealing with certain services, like dealing with certain public offices here, you're dealing with a much smaller office than you might be in Lisbon or Porto, again. So that means potentially a shorter waiting time. But if you have to go through the visa process and get the permissions and this and that, you may not even be dealing with Braga itself. If you get lucky, you could be dealing with the Braga office. But I know somebody who recently had to deal with CEF and had to go down all the way to a small town near Faro, literally the opposite end of the country. So that could be an issue to consider, that your appointment with the governmental office might not be where you are. You might be able to organize something where you are, but that can be a little bit more difficult to do. But if you're dealing with signing up for healthcare services or dealing with kind of the regular day-to-day things, doing that in Braga, I would say from my personal experience, has been much easier. And when I've tried to contact offices in other parts of the country, they haven't necessarily been as helpful or as easy to deal with. But can you still finish with things? Yes. I mean, even for example, I have a friend who lives in Lisbon who is dealing with getting onto the healthcare system here. The office was closed, it was open, it was not the right person. They had to go back like 4 or 5 different times. Here in Braga, just about everybody who I know who's gone there and had all their papers in order has been out in less than an hour. I mean, even for myself, I think I may have waited maybe 15 minutes or 20 minutes in line, and then it was another 5 minutes to sign up. Of course, this is as an Italian citizen, so if you're from another part of the world, your mileage may vary and what they'll need from you. But this is also a thing to take into consideration. That when you're not in a huge city and one of the most popular destinations, those offices just won't be as bogged down. So these, of course, are just things to take into consideration. But I do think this is a great place to wrap up this episode. So, of course, thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter. Of course, again, a huge thank you to those of you who've been helping to support this project through the one-time donations on rafaeldifuria.com/support. Thanks button here on YouTube, as well as the monthly support. So thank you all so much for helping this project to be able to continue.
Of course, I want to say another huge thank you to Border, border.io/NYAG. Thank you so much for sponsoring this episode. And of course, by supporting those who support this project, that helps this project to be able to continue.
Of course, as always, I'm Rafael di Furia. Stay safe and healthy out there, and I will see you all next time. Later.